Imagine knowing 3 languages perfectly. Imagine being able to read, write, and speak with the eloquence of scholars while your hands picked cotton under a burning sun. Imagine having the key to freedom in your mouth with every word you spoke, yet choosing to stay in chains. This is not a story of ignorance or fear. This is a story of something far more powerful, something that would challenge everything you think you know about survival, family, and what it truly means to be free. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Marie-Claire Beaumont, a woman who could recite Voltaire from memory, never once tried to run. And you'll never think about freedom the same way again. The first time Jean-Baptiste heard his mother speak French, he was 5 years old, and he thought she was talking to ghosts. It was late, long past the time when the overseer's lantern had made its final sweep past their cabin, and the darkness outside was so complete it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. His mother, Marie-Claire, sat by the small hearth where the last embers glowed like dying stars. And from her lips came sounds he had never heard in daylight. Soft, rolling, beautiful sounds that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the pine forests and cotton fields of the Beaumont plantation. "Maman, who are you talking to?" he whispered, his small voice cracking with fear and wonder. Marie-Claire turned to him, and in the firelight, her face looked younger than it ever did in the harsh brightness of day. She smiled, a rare thing, and held out her hand. "Come here, mon petit, I'm talking to you. I'm teaching you who you really are." Jean-Baptiste didn't understand, but he came to her anyway, drawn by something in her voice that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. That night she began to teach him French, the language her grandmother had brought from Saint-Domingue, the language that had survived the Middle Passage, survived the lash, survived the deliberate erasure of everything that made them human in the eyes of their captors. "Why do we have to hide it?" he asked her weeks later, after he'd learned enough words to form questions in this secret tongue. "Because, mon fils, this language is ours. It's the one thing Master Beaumont cannot take from us, because he doesn't even know we have it. In the fields, we speak his English. In the big house, we speak his English. But here, in the dark, in the quiet, we speak the language of our souls." By the time Jean-Baptiste was 12, he spoke 3 languages fluently. English, the Golagichi Creole that most of the enslaved people on the plantation used among themselves, and French, the secret language of the night. He could read too, taught in stolen moments by his mother who had learned from her mother who had learned from hers, a chain of knowledge passed down like precious jewels hidden in the darkness. He read the master's newspapers when he cleaned the study, read the letters that came from Charleston and Paris, read the books in the library that Master Beaumont never touched but kept for show. It was through reading that Jean-Baptiste first learned that people like him, enslaved people, had risen up in Saint-Domingue and created a free nation called Haiti. It was through reading that he learned about the Underground Railroad, about the North, about places where the color of your skin didn't determine whether you were property or a person. It was through reading that he learned escape was possible. "Maman," he said one night when he was 15, his voice low and urgent, "I've been reading about the North, about freedom. We could go. I know the routes now. I've heard the stories from the travelers who passed through. We could make it." Marie-Claire was silent for a long time, her hands still as they rested in her lap. Around them, the cabin creaked with the breathing of his 3 younger siblings, all of whom she had also taught French in the secret hours of the night. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Jean-Baptiste's chest tighten. "Do you know why I taught you French, mon fils? Do you truly know? To preserve our heritage, to keep a part of ourselves free." "Yes, but also so you would understand that freedom is not always found by running away from something. Sometimes it's found by staying for something greater than yourself." Jean-Baptiste felt frustration rise in his throat like bile. "How can you say that? We're slaves, maman. We're property. Every day we stay is another day we're not free. And where would we go? The 5 of us, running through the woods. Your sister Elise is only 7. Your brother Thomas has the coughing sickness. We would be caught within days, and then what? Sold away from each other? Beaten? Killed? Is that freedom? It's better than this." Jean-Baptiste's voice rose, and Marie-Claire quickly put her hand over his mouth. "Hush, you'll wake the others." She waited until he nodded, then removed her hand. "Listen to me, Jean-Baptiste. I know what you're feeling. I felt it too when I was your age. I could have run a dozen times. I speak French better than Master Beaumont's wife. I can read and write and cipher. I could have passed for free in Charleston, could have made my way to a ship, could have disappeared into the cities of the north. But I didn't. Do you know why?" Jean-Baptiste shook his head, tears burning in his eyes. "Because when I was 16, I gave birth to you, and holding you in my arms, I realized that freedom without you would be prison. This place, this horrible place, became bearable because I could give you something they could never take. Language, knowledge, the understanding that you are not what they say you are. You are Jean-Baptiste Beaumont only in name, but in your heart, in your mind, in your soul, you are Jean-Baptiste Toussaint, named for the liberator of Haiti, and you carry within you the voice of your ancestors who were kings and queens and scholars and artists. But what good is that if I'm still picking cotton tomorrow morning?" Jean-Baptiste's voice broke. Marie-Claire cupped his face in her calloused hands. "Because tomorrow morning, when you pick that cotton, you will know that this is not all you are. And someday, when the time is right, when it's safe, when you can take your knowledge and your languages and your dignity into a world that's ready to see you as human, you will walk away from this place. But you will not run like a frightened animal. You will walk like a man who knows his worth. And until that day comes, you will survive. We will all survive. Together." That night marked a change in Jean-Baptiste. He stopped seeing his languages as merely a secret to keep, and started seeing them as a foundation to build upon. He began to teach his siblings not just French, but everything else he learned. Mathematics from the ledgers he glimpsed, geography from the maps in the study, history from the newspapers and books. The cabin became a hidden schoolhouse where enslaved children learned to dream in 3 languages. But the plantation was not a place where dreams went unnoticed. 3 years later, when Jean-Baptiste was 18, Master Beaumont's nephew, a cruel young man named Richard, who had come to learn the plantation business, began to notice that something was different about the Beaumont slaves. They were too smart, too knowing. He started watching them, listening to them, trying to catch them in some act of defiance. It was Elise, now 10 and bright as a summer morning, who made the mistake. She was cleaning the parlor when Richard walked in, and in her nervousness she dropped a crystal vase. It shattered on the floor, and without thinking she gasped, "Mon Dieu!" Richard froze. "What did you just say?" Elise's eyes went wide with terror. "Nothing, Master Richard. Nothing, sir. You spoke French. A slave girl speaking French." Richard's face twisted with something between fascination and rage. "Where did you learn that?" "I didn't, sir. I don't know, friend." "Sure." But it was too late. Richard grabbed her arm and dragged her out to the yard where Marie-Claire was hanging laundry. "Does this child speak French?" he demanded. Marie-Claire's face remained perfectly calm, perfectly blank. "French, Master Richard?" "No, sir. She must have heard it from the mistress and didn't know what she was saying." Richard wasn't satisfied, but he had no proof, and Master Beaumont himself intervened, annoyed at his nephew's excitement over nothing. But the damage was done. Richard started paying closer attention, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth. That night, Marie-Claire gathered her children in the cabin. "We've been careless," she said in French, her voice steady despite the fear Jean-Baptiste could see in her eyes. "From now on, we speak only English in Gullah, even here, even in the dark. The French must go deeper, into our hearts where no one can hear it." "But maman," Thomas said, his voice weak from the illness that never quite left his lungs, "if we don't speak it, won't we forget?" Marie-Claire smiled, and there was something fierce and beautiful in that smile. "No, mon fils, you cannot forget who you are. The language lives in you now, in the way you think, in the way you see the world. They can take our words, but they cannot take what those words have built inside us." She was right, in a way. Even when they stopped speaking French aloud, the language remained in them like a second heartbeat. But something else remained too. Richard's suspicion. He began to test them, speaking French phrases to see if they understood. watching their faces for any flicker of recognition. The family became experts at blankness, at showing nothing, at becoming invisible even when they were seen. And then, one autumn morning when the cotton was heavy on the plants and the air was thick with the promise of an early frost, everything changed. A letter arrived from Charleston, brought by a messenger on horseback who looked exhausted and afraid. Master Beaumont read it in his study, while Jean-Baptiste stood silently by, refilling his water glass as he'd been trained to do. The master's face went white, then red, then white again. "It's impossible," Beaumont whispered. "The banks have failed. Everything is gone." Jean-Baptiste didn't react, but his mind raced. He'd read about the panic of 1837, the financial crisis sweeping through the South. If Beaumont had lost his money, if the plantation was in trouble, what would that mean for them? He found out soon enough. Within a month, Beaumont began selling off his enslaved people to pay his debts. Families were torn apart, screaming children pulled from their mothers' arms, husbands separated from wives. Jean-Baptiste watched in horror as the plantation was dismantled piece by piece, knowing that his family's turn would come. "We have to run now," he told Marie-Claire desperately, "before he sells us. Once we're separated, we'll never find each other again." But Marie-Claire shook her head. "Not yet. Trust me, mon fils, not yet." What Jean-Baptiste didn't know was that his mother had been planning for this moment for years. Every night when she had taught him French, every word of Voltaire she had recited, every lesson in mathematics and geography and history had been preparation for a future she had seen coming like a distant storm on the horizon. Marie-Claire Beaumont was no ordinary woman, and the story of how she came to be on this plantation was far more complex than her son had ever imagined. 23 years earlier, Marie-Claire had been Marie-Claire Toussaint, the daughter of a free Haitian merchant who had fled to Charleston after the Revolution. Her father had been educated in Paris, wealthy, respected in certain circles. But when yellow fever swept through Charleston, both her parents had died within days of each other, and Marie-Claire, only 15 and suddenly alone, had been vulnerable to the predatory systems of the South. Without papers to prove her free status, without family to protect her, she had been kidnapped by slave catchers and sold to the highest bidder. That bidder had been Master Beaumont's father. She had never told her children this story because she didn't want them to know what had been stolen from her. But she had also never forgotten who she truly was. The French she taught them wasn't just a slave language passed down through generations. It was the language of her faith. Ars library, of the books she had read in a beautiful house in Charleston before it had all been taken away. And she had spent 23 years on this plantation, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was hers. That moment came in the form of a lawyer from Charleston named Etienne Dupré, who arrived at the plantation just as Beaumont was preparing to sell Marie-Claire and her children. Dupré was a free man of color, unusual for the South, and he carried with him documents that made Beaumont's face go even paler than the financial letter had. These papers proved that Marie-Claire Toussaint was born free, the daughter of Pierre and Marguerite Toussaint of Charleston, Dupré said, his French accented English precise and unyielding. Her enslavement was illegal. Furthermore, under South Carolina law, any children born to a free woman are themselves free, regardless of the circumstances. "You have been holding 5 free people in bondage for nearly 2 decades, Monsieur Beaumont." Jean-Baptiste, who had been called to the study to serve refreshments, stood frozen in the corner, the pitcher in his hands trembling so badly that water sloshed over the rim. His mother was free, had always been free. How was this possible? Beaumont sputtered and raged, but the documents were irrefutable. More than that, Dupré had leverage. "I could bring charges against you that would ruin what little reputation you have left," the lawyer said calmly. "Or you could sign these papers edging the Toussaint family's free status, and we can all go our separate ways quietly." Later, in the cabin that was suddenly no longer a prison, Jean-Baptiste confronted his mother with tears streaming down his face. "You knew? All this time, you knew we could be free?" Marie-Claire's own eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I didn't know until 2 years ago when I managed to get a letter to the free-colored community in Charleston through a visiting preacher. I told them my story, gave them my father's name. It took Monsieur Dupré all this time to find the records to build the case. But yes, mon fils, I knew there was a chance. Then why didn't you tell us? Why did we stay here, living like this, when you were looking for a way out? Because hope is dangerous. If I had told you and the case had fallen through, if the papers couldn't be found, the disappointment would have broken you. I needed you to be strong. I needed you to survive. And I needed you to learn, to prepare, so that if freedom came, you would be ready for it. Jean-Baptiste sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of what his mother had carried alone. But the things you said about staying for something greater than yourself, about not running, were true, Marie-Claire said, kneeling beside him. Even knowing there might be a legal path to freedom, I couldn't risk running and losing you all if we were caught. And more than that, there were others here, others who needed what I could give. Do you think you and your siblings were the only ones I taught? Every child in these cabins who is old enough to understand has learned to read, to cipher, to speak a language their masters don't know. I couldn't abandon them. And it was true. In the weeks that followed, as the Toussaint family prepared to leave the plantation, Jean-Baptiste saw the full extent of what his mother had built. Nearly 30 enslaved people, young and old, came to their cabin in the night to say goodbye, and every one of them spoke to Marie-Claire in French, thanking her for the gift of knowledge, for the piece of humanity she had preserved in them. What will happen to them? Jean-Baptiste asked his mother the night before they were to leave. They will survive, Marie-Claire said. With what I've taught them, they have a better chance than most. And someday, when freedom comes to all of them, they will be ready. That's all we can do, mon fils. Prepare for the freedom we cannot yet see, and hold on to the humanity they try to strip from us. The day they left the plantation, Jean-Baptiste looked back at the fields, at the cabins, at the people who remained behind. He felt guilt, gratitude, grief, and hope all tangled together in his chest. His youngest sister, Elise, held his hand tightly. "Will we really be free?" she asked in French, the first time she'd spoken it aloud in months. "Yes," he told her, "we will." But as they walked down the road toward Charleston, toward the new life Monzi, Dupré had helped arrange for them, Jean-Baptiste understood something profound that his mother had been trying to teach him all along. Freedom wasn't just about where your body was or whether someone called you property. It was about what lived inside your mind, what couldn't be touched or stolen or bought or sold. His mother had been free all along, even in chains, because she had never let them take her dignity, her knowledge, her sense of self. In Charleston, the Toussaint family moved into a small house in the free-colored community. Marie-Claire opened a school, teaching the children of free black families and escaped slaves alike. Jean-Baptiste became her assistant, using his multiple languages and his education to help others find their way to freedom. Thomas, despite his weak lungs, became a talented artist. Elise grew into a fierce advocate for abolition, and the youngest, Pierre and Marguerite, named for the grandparents they'd never known, grew up truly free, never knowing the taste of bondage. But Jean-Baptiste never forgot the people they'd left behind on the Beaumont plantation. He worked with the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people escape to the north. He used his languages to forge documents, to communicate with conductors, to pass messages in plain sight, because no one expected an educated black man to be so fluent in French. And every person he helped to freedom, he taught the same lesson his mother had taught him. Your freedom begins in your in your refusal to be what they say you are, in the language and knowledge you carry that they can never take away. Years later, when Jean-Baptiste was an old man, and the Civil War had finally ended slavery across the South, a young reporter came to interview him about his life. "I don't understand," the reporter said. "Your mother knew she might have a legal case for freedom, and you all spoke French fluently, which could have helped you pass as free in many places. Why didn't you run sooner?" Jean-Baptiste smiled, the same fierce, beautiful smile his mother used to wear. "Because running would have saved our bodies but broken our spirits. My mother understood that survival isn't just about escape, it's about preserving who you are until the world is ready to see you. We stayed because we were building something larger than our own freedom. We were building a foundation of knowledge and dignity that would outlast the plantation, outlast slavery itself. But so many died in bondage, waiting for freedom that never came, the reporter pressed. Yes, Jean-Baptiste acknowledged, and his eyes grew distant with memory. But they died as humans, not as the animals their masters tried to make them. My mother gave them that. She gave them a language their oppressors couldn't understand, an education that couldn't be stripped away, a sense of self that survived even when their bodies didn't. That was her gift. That was her revolution. The reporter left, unsatisfied with answers. That didn't fit the simple narrative of escape and triumph he'd been hoping for. But Jean-Baptiste didn't mind. Some truths were too complex for those who had never lived them to understand. That night, alone in his study surrounded by books in 3 languages, Jean-Baptiste took out a letter he'd kept for decades. It was from his mother, written just before she died, and he read it again in the flickering candlelight. Mon fils, you asked me once why we never ran, and I told you it was because freedom without family would be prison. But there was more I didn't say because you were too young to understand. We didn't run because I believed that the freedom worth having is the kind that transforms not just our circumstances but our souls. Any slave can run. It takes courage. But it takes something else entirely to stay in hell and build heaven inside your mind, to preserve your humanity in a system designed to strip it away, to teach others to do the same. I stayed because I believed that the knowledge and dignity we carried would outlast the chains, would outlast the plantation, would outlast even slavery itself. And I was right. You are the proof. Every child you've taught, every person you've helped to freedom, every word of French you speak is proof that they failed to break us. We won, mon fils. We won by refusing to be broken. Jean-Baptiste folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its place of honor. Outside, the city of Charleston hummed with the sounds of free people going about their lives, black and white living side by side in an uneasy peace that was still better than bondage. It wasn't the world his mother had dreamed of, not yet, but it was closer. And every day, in classrooms across the city, children were learning to read and write and speak in multiple languages, or being taught that they were more than what the world told them they were. The legacy of Marie Claire Toussaint lived on, not in grand monuments or history books, but in the quiet dignity of people who refused to let oppression define them, who understood that true freedom begins in the mind and spreads outward from there. She had never left the plantation until she had legal protection, had never spoken French in daylight until it was safe, had never run because the risk was too great. But she had been free all along, and she had made her children free too, in the only way that really mattered. Jean-Baptiste closed his eyes and whispered in French, Merci, maman. Thank you for teaching me that freedom is not a place you run to, but a way of being that no one can take away. And in the silence that followed, he could almost hear her voice answering back in the language of their souls, the language that had survived everything. Tu es libre, mon fils. You are free. You always were. This story is based on historical truth. Enslaved communities in South Carolina and other parts of the South preserved languages, knowledge, and cultures that their masters didn't know existed. They built schools in secret, taught each other to read despite laws forbidding it, and maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The question this story asks us to consider is complex. What is freedom? Is it only physical escape? Or can it also be the preservation of dignity, knowledge, and self-worth even in the most oppressive circumstances? Marie Claire and Jean-Baptiste represent the thousands of enslaved people who made impossible choices with no good options, who survived not by running, but by building something their oppressors could never touch. Their story challenges us to think about resistance in new ways. Not all resistance looks like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like a mother teaching her children to read by candlelight. Sometimes it looks like preserving a language in secret. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let your spirit be broken even when your body is in chains. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that freedom is not just about circumstances, but about consciousness. The enslaved people who learned French, who educated themselves, who preserved their cultures despite every attempt to erase them, were engaged in the most profound form of resistance, the refusal to be what oppression tried to make them. Their legacy lives on in Eve, wry person who refuses to be defined by their circumstances, who pursues knowledge and dignity even when the world tells them they don't deserve it, who understands that true freedom starts in the mind and works its way outward from there. We honor them not by simplifying their stories into easy narratives of escape and triumph, but by grappling with the complexity of their choices and recognizing the extraordinary courage it took to preserve humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their freedom was hard-won, not in a single moment of escape, but in thousands of small acts of resistance that accumulated over time until the weight of their dignity could no longer be denied. That is the freedom worth fighting for. That is the freedom worth remembering.